A young orphan girl holding a newborn was being auctioned until a lonely rancher took them home late spring 1874. Dust clung to every surface of Cold Creek like a fever that would not break the sun. Was cruel, the kind of heat that cracked paint off church doors and turned every glare into judgment. At the center of town in front of the courthouse steps, a crude wooden platform had been erected not for justice but for something far uglier. She poisoned him, I tell you, killed her own husband, and now parades that bastard around like a trophy. No one's going to take that cursed thing. She's tainted, mark my words. She'll bring death to any house she enters. The woman in question said nothing. Her name was Betty Cobburn. Barely 18, though today she looked far older. Her dress was torn at the hem, dirt streaked across her arms, dried blood crusted at her temple, chains clinked around her wrists and ankles, loose enough to let her cradle the newborn in her arms, but tight enough to keep her labeled guilty. The baby, not yet 6 weeks old, whimpered in confusion, too young to understand the hatred in the air. Betty curled her body around him, shielding his tiny frame from a rotting tomato that exploded against her back. Her lips didn't tremble, her eyes stayed dry, but she kept her head bowed, not from shame, but from fear that if she looked up someone would see that she still had some pride left, and they'd come for that. Jed Colburn, her late husband, had been buried 2 days earlier, found stiff and lifeless after a quiet supper. The coroner noting something off in his color. The rumor that followed wasn't based on evidence, only convenience. A young wife, an old man, a crying baby, in a town that needed someone to blame. They called it a mercy auction. Better than jail, better than the noose. Someone could bid to take her in, redeem her, reform her, or use her however they saw fit. $2. A voice snickered from the crowd. I'll take her if she keeps her mouth shut, but only if I get the baby too. Betty flinched, her grip tightened on the child. A rock flew past her cheek. The jeering grew louder, then came the voice, low, even unyielding. That's enough. The words cut through the heat like thunder. Silence fell. A man stepped forward from the fringe of the gathering, dusty boots, faded coat, a revolver on one hip, a silver watch chain glinting beneath his vest. He walked with the steadiness of someone who had been in worse places than this and lived to talk about it, though he never did. I will take her. The sheriff blinked. Mr. Pike, Gabriel, you sure this is not a matter of charity? I said. I will take her, Gabriel repeated, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat. The clink of coins inside was unmistakable. Here for the bond, and enough to keep every damn mouth in this town shut. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Gabriel Pike was a name folks respected from a distance. 36, a former Union scout. He had returned from the war with a limp, a fortune, and a refusal to be anyone's hero. He ran his ranch alone, kept his fields clean, and never once brought a woman across his threshold. Now he was buying a murder suspect. The sheriff hesitated only a moment before nodding. Untie. A deputy moved in with a key. Betty didn't speak. Her arms stayed tight around her son as the shackles fell to the dirt. Her legs buckled slightly when she stepped off the platform, but she caught herself before she fell. Gabriel approached her slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal. His eyes, gray and calm, met hers, not cold, not pitying. Just still, can you walk? He asked. She didn't answer. She just nodded. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the waiting wagon. Come on, then. She followed as they climbed aboard. A man in the crowd spat at the ground. Bet you won't last a week with her, Pike. Gabriel said nothing. He pulled the reins, and the horses turned. The wagon creaked. The sun glared, and the murmurs behind them faded into wind. Betty held her child close and did not look back. The wagon rumbled down a long stretch of dirt road, flanked by prairie grass and shadows that clung like regrets. Betty sat in silence, her baby cradled against her chest. Jonah had stopped crying, but his breath still came in uneven hitches, as if the fear of the crowd still lingered in his tiny bones. She rocked him gently, eyes staring blankly at the trail ahead. Gabriel Pike did not speak. He kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the residential. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, carrying away whatever thoughts he had. Every so often, he glanced at her, just briefly, but said nothing. When the baby shivered, Gabriel removed his coat and handed it back toward her. You'll both freeze, he said. Betty hesitated only a second before wrapping Jonah tighter and draping the heavy coat around them both. It smelled faintly of leather and pine smoke. She did not thank him. She had forgotten how they rode in silence until the landscape began to change. The hills gave way to thicket of pine and cedar. A Shallow creek curved around the base of a ridge, and tucked beside it stood a wide ranch house, weathered gray and flanked by a barn, a tool shed, and 3 grazing horses that barely lifted their heads as they arrived. The place looked like it had once held a dozen people and had not seen more than one in years. Gabriel pulled the horses to a stop in front of the porch. "This is it," he said. Betty stepped down slowly, legs stiff from fear and cold. Gabriel came around the wagon, opened the front door, and motioned inside. "You'll take the room to the right," he said. "Has a stove and a water basin. There's supper on the table." She hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to remove her shoes, whether to ask permission, whether to even breathe. Gabriel seemed to sense it. "It's your roof now too. Coming inside." The house was plain but clean, wood floors, heavy curtains, a single oil lamp flickered in the main room. He pointed her toward a small room just off the hallway. Inside, a modest bed, a washstand, a folded blanket, and to her astonishment, on the table beside the bed, a bowl of steaming soup, a bottle of warm milk for Jonah, and a single folded piece of cloth. Gabriel spoke, his voice quiet and dry. "Happy 1 month, little one." Then he turned and left her alone. Betty stood frozen for a moment. She could not breathe. No one in the entire past month of terror and judgment had marked her son's life as something worth celebrating. Her hands trembled as she reached for the spoon. Jonah stirred and began to cry again. Hungry, she fed him, first holding him close as tears burned silently down her cheeks. The room was warm, too warm. She had forgotten what kindness felt like. It hurt. She did not eat much. Her stomach rebelled against peace, but she folded the blanket over Jonah and sat beside him, listening. The house was not entirely quiet. Somewhere down the hallway, in the room on the opposite end, she heard it, a soft, hesitant sound, strings, fingers against wood, a melody not polished but gentle. Gabriel Pike playing a guitar. Betty closed her eyes. She remembered that sound, not the music, but the quietness between the notes. 3 years ago at the autumn fair in Red Bluff, she had been selling apples beside her cousin when a gust of wind knocked a man's scarf from his shoulders. She had picked it up and handed it to him. Just a small moment he had thanked her. Their eyes had met, that was all, and yet here it was the same man. The same eyes. On the table beside the soup bowl, folded carefully, was a handkerchief, old, familiar, faintly embroidered with initials faded from use. The same one. Betty touched it with uncertain fingers, then pulled it close, pressing it to her lips. She did not cry again. She had no tears left, but she lay back beside her son, listening to the song down the hall, a song not meant for her, but not meant to be hidden either. Outside, the trees whispered with the wind. Inside, for the first time in a month, Betty slept without dreaming of chains. Mornings came slowly in that part of the land where the sun took its time to rise over the pine ridges. Betty rose earlier. She moved like smoke through the house, silent, unseen, cautious. Her days were a pattern of small labors and gentle rocking, feeding Jonah, washing linens, sweeping dust from corners no one had touched in years, and avoiding Gabriel Pike's eyes. She had learned early in life that a man's eyes could mean 100 things, none of them safe, but Gabriel's gaze, when it landed on her, was always brief, respectful, curious maybe, but never hungry. That frightened her more than anything. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, and it was in that silence, that distance, that she found herself lowering her guard little by little. In the mornings, she would find firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, water already drawn from the well, a folded towel waiting on the wash stand. Gabriel never mentioned these things. She never asked, but she noticed one afternoon she caught herself humming to Jonah while scrubbing the kitchen table. The windows were open, the breeze was kind, and for the first time in over a year, she had not looked over her shoulder in fear. That frightened her too, but memories had their own way of creeping back. It had been less than 2 years since she'd worn white and been wed to Jed Colburn, by arrangement, by pressure, by lack of any real choice. She was 17, standing at the altar like a lamb, waiting to be handed over. Jed was twice her age, with a voice that snapped like dry rope and hands that smelled of tobacco and old iron. She had not been beaten, not in the way folks talked about, but she had not been touched with kindness either. Her days were filled with long silences, cold meals, and rooms she was forbidden to enter. Jed kept her clothes like a possession, something to be polished, but never heard. The only warmth in that house came months later, wrapped in blood and cries, when Jonah was born. He was hers. No one could take that from her, not even death. She clung to him now, As if her soul depended on it. Gabriel, for his part, kept to himself. He spent most days tending the fence line, working the horses, or sitting at the back porch with a ledger and a glass of rainwater. But in the evenings, he sometimes sat across from her in the main room, the fire crackling between them. He would sip coffee and glance her way like he was waiting for the right silence to speak into. One night, he finally did. "I was in Montana once," he said. "Winter campaign, cavalry job, snow so deep you lost the men before the bullets." Betty looked up. He was staring into the flames, his jaw tight. "We lost 11 in 3 days, not to gunfire, just cold and hunger. I brought 2 back, both blind from frostbite. The rest." He trailed off. She waited, unsure what to say. "That was the last time I wore a uniform." He stood then and went to bed. She sat there long after Jonah, asleep in her lap, the fire shrinking to embers. That was the first piece of himself he had given her. She held it carefully, like something precious and breakable, but kindness could only hold off sickness for so long. 3 nights later, she collapsed. It came on fast, sweat shivering, then sudden darkness. She had just put Jonah down when her legs buckled beside the bed. The world turned sideways, then nothing. A minute when she opened her eyes, it was morning. She was in bed, warm, the smell of broth in the air. Sunlight filtered through the curtain. Her head throbbed, but her limbs were wrapped in blankets and something deeper comfort. Jonah was cradled on the chair beside her, swaddled and sleeping peacefully, and Gabriel sat in the far corner, slouched hat over his eyes, a cold cloth still damp in his hand. His boots were off, his coat hung from the chair. He had stayed with her all night. Betty blinked hard once, twice. She looked at her son, then at the man who had not touched her, not undressed her, not taken advantage, just stayed, just watched, just protected. For the first time, the ache in her chest was not fear, it was something closer to disbelief and hope. She lay back against the pillow, silent and safe. Summer deepened its roots into the soil. The days grew longer, but at the ranch time moved gently. Betty fell into rhythm. Without realizing it, she fed Jonah early, swept the porch, then followed Gabriel into the garden with quiet steps. He never assigned her chores, never asked her to do more than she wished, but she did them anyway, grateful for the silence and the distance he allowed her to fill on her own terms. He showed her how to tend the squash vines, when to cut mint before it turned bitter, and how to spot the nests raccoons left beneath the fence line. They moved like 2 ghosts from different wars, one carrying the weight of betrayal, the other memories of men who had never come home. One morning, he brought her to the sheep pen and handed her a bag of feed. "Crouch low, let them come to you, don't rush them, they're wary of sudden things." Betty knelt, holding out her palm. A young lamb nudged her fingers, bleated softly, then pressed its woolly head against her knee. She smiled quickly, faintly, then caught herself and stood too fast. Later that week, Gabriel handed her a revolver. "I reckon a woman's got the right to know how to protect what's hers." Betty stared at the cold metal, hesitated, then took it. Her fingers wrapped around the grip like it was an anchor and a promise. All at once, he taught her to fire into the dirt behind the barn, to breathe slow, to trust her hand. She never missed. Still, something inside her would not yield. Jonah laughed more now, cooed, when Gabriel entered the room, even reached for his beard once with a pudgy fist. Gabriel had only smiled and said, "You've got a grip like your mother." Betty had flinched at the compliment that night as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed into the trees. Gabriel spoke softly, "You know, you two can stay for good if you want." Betty did not turn her head. "I am not the kind of woman you need," she said. He let the silence stretch, but she filled it with more. "I have already been claimed, branded, thrown away. Everything you see standing here is what's left after the fire." Gabriel rested his elbows on his knees, stared at the horizon. "I don't need you to be anything," he said, "except alive." He stood, nodded once, and went inside. Betty remained where she was, her chest tight with a feeling she could not name. Later that night, after Jonah had fallen asleep and the crickets began their long sermon, Betty found Gabriel outside. He had been splitting wood most of the day and now sat slumped on the porch bench, boots off, eyes closed, his breath slow and deep. He had not even made it to bed. The moonlight wrapped him in silver, softening the hard lines of his face. He looked older and younger all at once. The man who had carried her out of a storm of judgment now slept like he belonged to no one, not even himself. She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped forward. A blanket draped over her arm. She laid it across him gently. Her hand brushed his shoulder, then instinctively moved to his face. Her fingers hovered near his cheekbone, and then slowly she touched him just once, a simple press of skin to skin, not longing, not lust, just a Question without words. Gabriel did not stir. Betty withdrew her hand, stood for a long moment watching him, then turned back inside. She closed the door without a sound, and for the first time she let herself hope that maybe one day her hands could hold something without it. Breaking the peace on the ranch was the kind that whispered of endings, soft but always shifting. Gabriel Pike had known that stillness before it came in war. Right before the ambush, now it echoed again each time he watched Betty brush her son's hair from his eyes or hum quietly while sweeping the porch. One cloudy morning he saddled his horse. Need to pick up a few things, he told her. She nodded, unaware he was heading far beyond Cold Creek. Hours later, Gabriel rode into Black Hollow, stopping outside a crooked little cavern lined with herbs and old bones. Dr. Elmer Pritchard squinted through thick glasses. Well, if it isn't Gabriel, Pike thought. You disappeared east. Not quite. I need to ask you about a corpse. Jed Colburn. The doctor's brow furrowed. That old snake? Yeah, I saw him. Skin was wrong, veins dark. Looked like poison, but no one asked what kind. Bearcap mushroom, Namgo, slow, bitter. Nearly undetectable. Only folks ever stocked it were the Cobburns back when they brewed specialties for Jed's pain. Who had access to that herb? Anyone who worked the grounds, but Jed was careless. And I wouldn't put it past the wrong man. Gabriel already knew who he meant. Clive Remsen, former stable hand, fired after a public shouting match with Jed. He had cooked, sometimes cleaned, rarely, and always watched the world like it owed him something. Now he was back in town, talking about Betty like she needed rescuing. Gabriel thanked the doctor and rode toward the old Cobburn estate. Abandoned since Jed's death, the windows were shuttered, the barn locked, but Gabriel found the herb shed behind the main house. Dust clung to every jar. He read the labels, many written in Betty's neat hand, until one tucked in the back caught his eye. Barely marked, he opened it. The stench was unmistakable. Bearcap. He sealed it again, then spotted a torn scrap of paper beneath the shelf, a supply log. Clive's name was there beside a requisition mark. Gabriel pocketed both and rode back. Hard by the time he reached the ranch, the sun had dipped low. His hand bled from a thorn, and his shirt was soaked through. Betty stood on the porch, Jonah in her lap. She didn't speak, only watched. He handed her the residential and moved toward the wash basin. Wait, she said softly. He crossed the porch and took his wrist without a word. She unwrapped the cloth, cleaned the wound, and applied salve from a tin she kept by the door. Her hands didn't tremble. She didn't ask where he'd been. Gabriel let her touch linger. For the first time in days, he met her eyes. She looked up. The storm and sorrow in her face softened into something steadier. Trust, maybe small and cautious. I'm not used to people coming back, she whispered. I don't leave people, he said. She nodded. Once finished bandaging and stepped inside. Gabriel stood alone for a long while, the scent of her still in the doorway. In his pocket, the jar and the paper pressed against his ribs, proof that something had been wrong all along. He looked out toward the ridge, the house behind him. Quiet justice would not come from the town, not from the men with titles or the books with rules. It would come from hands like his, steady, unrelenting, ready. Late one afternoon, as the sun dragged its golden limbs across the horizon, two horses crested the ridge that overlooked Gabriel Pike's ranch. Betty was hanging laundry when she saw them. She froze mid-mash, wet sheet clutched in her hands as the riders grew closer, one in a crisp gray coat, the other with the swagger of someone who did not knock before entering. Clive Remsen. She knew him by the way he rode, like the land owed him something. The man beside him, older and clean-shaven with a satchel full of papers, was clearly a lawyer, not a local one, not one she recognized from Cold Creek. Gabriel met them at the gate. He said nothing, only held it open and gestured toward the house. Inside, the air turned cold despite the heat still lingering on the porch. Clive removed his hat with a polished grace that did not match his eyes. Good evening, he said, voice oiled with civility. Gabriel, Miss Colburn. Betty stood near the fireplace, Jonah in her arms. She did not speak. Gabriel remained by the door, arms crossed. Clive cleared his throat, then opened the leather satchel and pulled out a sealed document. The lawyer stepped forward, placing it on the table with ceremonial precision. This, Clive began, is the last will and testament of Jed Colburn, recently discovered in a locked box beneath the floorboards of his study, alongside a notarized seal and the family crest. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Clive smiled thinly in it. Jed expresses concern about Miss Coburn's abilities, her temperament, the scandal surrounding the boy's parentage. Betty's jaw clenched, but she held her silence. Clive continued, The will transfers the majority of the Cobburn estate, including all land assets, to myself, being as you know his most trusted employee for nearly a decade. He tapped the page with 2 fingers, then folded his hands. In front of him, however, he added in a gesture of grace, I am offering Miss Coburn continued residence on the property. As a formal housekeeper, she will have a room, meals, a small wage. The boy will be permitted to stay as long as he does not interfere with business operations. The lawyer nodded in agreement, as if this were a generous offer. I understand this is a difficult situation, Clive went on, but we must think practically. Reputation, stability, community expectations. I am willing to protect Miss Coburn's honor discreetly. Betty looked at him, then not with fear, not even hatred, just a quiet, steady calm. She stepped forward, gently placing Jonah into the crib Gabriel had built in the corner. Then she turned back to Clive and said nothing. Clive's smile faltered. Gabriel moved from the doorway and took a seat at the table. He leaned back, chair creaking under his weight, and finally looked Clive in the eye. That all? Clive bristled. I expected a little more respect considering the circumstances. Gabriel reached for the envelope and flicked it open. He scanned the page, noting the signature, the seal, the handwriting, things that could fool most men, but Gabriel Pike had seen forged orders that cost soldiers their lives. This was no different. He slid the paper back across the table. You're forgetting one thing, Clive. And what's that? Gabriel stood slow and measured. Real men do not need forged paper to claim what they want. They fight for it, and they damn sure do not insult a woman in her own home while pretending to offer her charity. Clive's jaw clenched. I'll return in 3 days with the sheriff if necessary. Then bring him, Gabriel replied, but do not bring that lawyer. He will not walk off my land again. The lawyer palled visibly. Clive turned without another word. Gabriel followed them out, closed the gate behind them, and
they were nothing but dust on the horizon inside. Betty picked Jonah up again. She rocked him silent, her eyes fixed on nothing. That night she did not speak a word at supper. Gabriel did not press her. They ate in silence, candlelight flickering between them. He went out after, as he always did, to check the barn and throw hay. It was dark when he returned. On the table in his room was a folded square of white linen, freshly laundered, hand sewn along the edge, and careful stitching were 2 words, thank you. He picked it up, held it to his chest, and then without a word he folded it again, tighter this time, and slid it into the inside pocket of his shirt over his heart. Porter, he did not wear armor anymore, but sometimes a gesture could be stronger than steel. The storm arrived without warning. A low rumble crept over Cold Creek just after sundown, the kind that settled in your bones before it ever reached the sky. By nightfall the wind tore through the valley like a blade. Rain came hard and slanted, hurling itself against the windows, shaking the shutters. Betty had just put Jonah to sleep, the little boy curled under a knit blanket, breathing deep from a long day of crawling and giggles. She moved through the house, checking the latches, nerves humming low. When she entered the kitchen, Gabriel stood in the shadows, sharpening a knife with slow, steady rhythm. You feel it too, don't you? He said. She nodded, like something's coming. Then came the scent, smoke, acrid, bitter. Gabriel bolted for the front. Betty followed, heart thudding. The livestock barn was ablaze, orange flames slicing the dark sky. Not lightning, not accidental warning, a trap. Gunshots snapped from the tree, and Gabriel's voice was still, get Jonah. She ran, boots splashed behind the house. Men shouted. Betty heard them clearly. 3, maybe 4 grabbed the baby. She clutched Jonah to her chest, wrapped him in Gabriel's coat, and made for the back. Gabriel met her at the kitchen door, blood trickling from a cut on his head. Go now. He shoved the door open and pushed her into the storm. She slipped in the mud, caught herself, turned back, but he was already gone. Rifle raised, she ran through the downpour, every breath a fight. The wind howled like wolves, thunder cracked open the sky. She made it to the woods, breath ragged. Jonah whimpering against her. She crouched beneath a cedar, kissed his forehead, whispered, I'll come back. She laid him in a dry patch between the roots, wrapped in wool, then drew the revolver. Gabriel had taught her to use her feet, moved before her mind caught up. The trees swallowed her, lightning flashed as she reached the house. Gabriel was down, struggling against a larger man. Another crept up with a knife. Clive stood near the kitchen, soaked and furious, a blade raised high. Betty didn't hesitate. She fired. The shot cracked through the night. Clive screamed, dropped his knife, and hit the floor, clutching his shoulder. One of the thugs fled, the other froze, then ran. Betty stepped into the house, soaked to the bone, revolver still trembling in her hand. Her eyes never left Clive, who writhed on the floor cursing her with words that no longer touched her as she stepped closer. They called me a cursed bride, a killer with a cradle, said I. Poisoned a man just to be free. She lifted the revolver again, slow, steady. Her voice stayed calm. But tonight I saved a man who never once laid a hand on me when I was broken, who saw me when no one else did. She lowered the gun. Gabriel pushed to his feet, swaying, blood on his side. His hand touched her shoulder, not to hold her, just to ground himself. She looked at him, nodded once, then she placed the gun in his hand and turned toward the woods, toward her son. Gabriel Pike did not die, he drifted close, fever burning him for days, breath shallow, skin pale as parchment, but he did not cross that final threshold. Betty never left his side. She wiped his brow, changed his bandages, fed him broth in slow spoonfuls. She mended his shirts with quiet fingers and sat beside him through the nights, whispering things she never thought she would say aloud. She never once called herself his wife, but every act said otherwise. When he finally opened his eyes, horsero and squinting into the morning light, he found her there, her head resting near his chest, Jonah asleep in her lap. Her first word was not hello, it was simply, "You're late." In town the storm left ripples. Clive Rimson, shackled and scowling, stood before a quiet court. The forged will unraveled fast under scrutiny. Witnesses spoke, signatures were compared. The town clerk confessed to overlooking details. The sheriff looked away. No one apologized to Betty, but no one spat when she passed either. Children no longer pointed. Women nodded politely. Men moved aside. Her name, once cursed, became something like neutral, almost clean. 3 weeks after the fire, just before sunrise, Betty folded a note and placed it beneath the tin teapot on the kitchen table. She packed a small bag, just clothes for Jonah, the blanket he liked best, and the carved wooden lamb Gabriel had whittled for his first birthday. She did not wake Gabriel. She stood over his bed, watched the rise and fall of his breath, and whispered something against the air. Then she took Jonah's hand and stepped out into the dim blue of dawn. They reached the front gate just as the sky began to blush. Jonah toddled beside her, sleepy but steady. Then he stopped. A soft sound escaped him, half whimper, half giggle. He turned back toward the house and pointed. Betty followed his hand. Gabriel stood on the porch, leaning on a crutch, his left leg bound but weight-bearing. His eyes were darker from the healing, but they were steady. He did not shout, did not plead. He just lifted something in his free hand, the handkerchief, the one she had embroidered weeks ago, clean pressed, untouched since the day she left it on his table. "It's been right here," he said, "since the day you gave it to me." He paused, eyes never leaving hers. "And the bed you slept in, it's still warm." Betty did not move for a heartbeat. Then she did. She walked toward him, not with guilt, not with hesitation, but with a calm certainty. When she reached him, she did not ask permission. She put her arms around him and held tight. "I do not come with a dowry," she whispered. "I do not come with a name." Gabriel held her just as tight. "I don't need either." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I bring a child in gratitude if you don't need a wife. Then let me be the one who keeps your fire lit." Gabriel smiled for the first time in what felt like months. "You already are." Years passed, the house filled with music, with smells of bread and firewood, with the patter of small feet across polished wood. Jonah grew strong and fast, wild with energy. Every evening when Gabriel returned from the fields, the boy would bolt from the porch, shouting, "Pa," and wrap himself around his leg, muddy boots and all. And Betty, once the girl no one wanted, stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flower hair, sunlit from the open windows, watching them with eyes that no longer held fear. They never spoke again of the auction, of the fire and the past names she had shed. They didn't have to. They had built something new, and it held. Some stories end with justice, others end with peace, but the rarest ones, like Betty's, end not in triumph but in quiet redemption, in a fire rekindled, in a name reclaimed not by law but by love. From the ashes of a lie she built a home, and in the eyes of a child and a man who never asked for anything, she finally became free. If this story stirred something in you, then subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale is a journey through dust, danger, and the kind of love that refuses to die, because